I think everybody who exercises the duties of citizenship in America should read this book. And I think they'll benefit from it, and I think the country will benefit from it. I think that we need to have an understanding, if we're going to run our government, of the meaning and the ways of the great instrument that authorizes all government in America. And this is one of the best ways to do it, is to become an expert on the Federalist Papers. Hello, my name is Larry Arnn. I work here at Hillsdale College, and this is an online course on the Federalist Papers. I hope you enjoyed this course. It's one of the most important you could study. The Federalist Papers were written in 1787 and 1788, and they are the foremost American contribution to political thought. They are one of the greatest books ever written. They were written as newspaper articles. There are 85 of them. They make a book about that thick, something like that, not that tall. It's not that long to read them, but they're very deserving of study. They're important for a variety of reasons. They're important because they're great. They're important because they concern the most successful constitution in the history of the world. And they're important because of who wrote them. They were written by three people. One was John Jay, who negotiated the treaty that ended the American Revolutionary War and established the United States of America, and who was later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a really remarkable man. He wrote 4 or 5 of the Federalist Papers, and they concerned foreign policy. He had much to do with that in his life. And the bulk of them were written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Alexander Hamilton was from New York, James Madison was from Virginia, and they are among the greatest people in political history. They both helped to found the country. Madison was always close to Thomas Jefferson, both Virginians, succeeded Jefferson as president, and Hamilton was from New York, originally born in Jamaica. And he was among the makers of the Revolution. He was Secretary of the Treasury in the first Washington administration. But when they wrote the Federalist Papers, they were fresh from writing the Constitution of the United States, and those two people wrote it more than any other two people, although it was written by several dozen people who had a lot to do with it. And they came together to produce the Constitution, and they studied hard before they did it. And then they spent those months, from May until September, in Philadelphia in a closed room with the delegates from the states, composing the Constitution. And it wasn't exactly the Constitution the way they wanted it when they started, but the Federalist Papers are testimony to how much they liked it when it was finished. And so just having written the document and having debated every point in it with a lot of very impressive people, they wrote out why it was so. And so that makes it remarkable too, because it's not just some people working in a university who wrote this, it was the people who made the document. And these were people of very unusual quality. The Federalist Papers is also important because of who read them. And that touches on something fundamental to the Constitution, something mentioned often in the Federalist. And that is, they were read by people who were deciding whether to vote for delegates to state ratifying conventions who would vote for or against the Constitution. They were published in New York. They had their main political effect in New York. They weren't circulated everywhere. I'm going to go over the timeline a little bit of how it all unfolded. It's an extremely exciting time, and it was an intense time. The Constitution of the United States was the subject of a grand national debate, and one of the defects of the Articles of Confederation that the Federalist Papers talk about quite a lot is that the Articles of Confederation were passed by the Continental Congress as an ordinary law, and then they acted under that law. And what that meant was there wasn't anything above the ordinary law. If they wanted to change it, presumably they could. But the Constitution was passed by delegates in the states elected by the people for that one special purpose. There were these state ratifying conventions, and in some states there were more than one. And because they didn't get the answer they liked the first time, and then they came back and got a different answer, or they couldn't reach a conclusion the first time, and they came back and a new convention did reach a conclusion. So the people are reading this thing, and they are under the principles of the Federalist Papers and of America, of the American founding. They have a right to choose their government. Consent of the government is a fundamental principle, and so they're about to give their consent. And these things are written by the people who wrote the Constitution for them to read to help them make up their mind. I'm going to read you one of the most famous passages from the Federalist Papers. It's in Federalist number 1. It was written by Alexander Hamilton, and it's on the first page of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton writes, "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their contact and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." Think of the end of that. Are we to be governed by reflection and choice, or are we to be governed by accident and force? What's it like when force rules? I was teaching Aristotle here at the college yesterday, and Aristotle talks about the way tyrants rule. They rule by force. And tyrants are hated because they rule by force. People don't like to be forced to do what things they don't want to do against their will, without their consent. And so one of the things that tyrants have to do to have longevity in office, because tyrannies, Aristotle says, don't last very long, is they have to make war on every kind of excellence, especially contemplative kinds, especially kinds owed to God. Because they can't really get their way with people who think that there's something higher than them, and they can't really get their way with excellent people, so they tend to do things to corrupt the people. And of course they interfere with the raising of children and 1,000 things. And so that's a big question that Hamilton says. The American people, we, have been appointed to answer. The reason we've been appointed to answer this question is because we are in the most favorable circumstances. We understand the principles of liberty. We early Americans, we are very able to take care of ourselves. In fact, we're a very independent bunch of cusses. Came over here to the wilderness, been here about 150 years, and we've built a society, and it was like a chance to start over again. And yet, it's like the Western movies. In the Western movies, you know, especially the best ones, there's lots of guns in those movies. That's force. But somebody's always got a book. And The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a classic for this. And James Stewart in that is a lawyer, and he's got a law book. And there isn't anybody around, there isn't any facility around to write or print such a law book. That all comes from back somewhere else, right? And now they're out on the frontier, and they're trying to establish the law, and it's an enormous leg up that they know what it is. And that's the case of the people who settled in America. They knew about civilization and law, and that was precious, but also they got to start over. There weren't really very many priorities among them. And if you think about that for a minute, that fact alone justifies Hamilton's statement that it's up to us to prove that we could have political institutions that governed us by reflection and choice. In other words, we all get together and talk. Politics is fundamentally about talking. The human gift is to be able to talk. Only we can do that. And that means we can decide questions of justice and injustice and advantage and disadvantage. And so Hamilton is welcoming his readers to one of the most significant deliberations in the history of the world, is the way he puts it. And it proves something for all time. The reason it could prove it for all time is, in his opinion, if it can't be done here, it can't be done. This is the best chance ever. And so that's the perspective of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers proceeds in sections. There's a group of papers at the beginning about the rare opportunity we've got and about the dangers we face from foreign countries and the dangers we face from strife among ourselves. The deficiency of the Articles of Confederation, I'll say a word about that in a minute. About the fundamental principles that underlie the Constitution, especially in Federalist 9 and Federalist 10. They make the claim that they've discovered some new things about politics and that we can have a bigger country and yet govern it by consent, and that will make our law both stronger and safer, less likely to be oppressive to the people. Hamilton and Madison write 9 and 10, and they're profoundly important. They turn to analyzing the Constitution branch by branch. First the House of Representatives and the Senate, then the executive branch, then the judicial branch. And then they close with some concluding reflections on the importance of all this. And Hamilton makes the argument in one of the last Federalist Papers that we don't need a Bill of Rights. He changed his mind about that, as did Madison. So that's the structure of the thing. And it is then a commentary by the key people who wrote the Constitution, written for the people who ratified it. I say the debate was intense. The Constitutional Convention adopted the Constitution that we have today, part of today, on September 17th, 1787, having started their work in May. They transmitted it to the Congress a few days later to be sent out to the states. And on September 25, so 6 days later, 7 days later, 8 days later, I guess, the first anti-Federalist paper appears. In other words, a public argument why we shouldn't pass this thing. And if you like the Federalist Papers, and as you read them, I encourage you in our Constitution Reader, which you may have a copy of, to look at the Anti-Federalist Papers that are in there. There are very many of them. There are many more Anti-Federalist Papers than there are Federalist Papers. And their arguments are important, and the Federalist repeats those arguments often in the course of the Federalist Papers. And if you think about how fast everything happened, from the day that the Constitutional Convention was convened until Rhode Island, which actually only ratified the Constitution after the government under the Constitution went into operation. 32 months passed. And in those 32 months, there had to be a national debate state by state. The states had to elect delegates, so the state legislatures and governor had to pass a law that such delegates would be elected. They all did. They had to hold the election, and people campaigned for office on whether or not they'd vote for the Constitution. And then the conventions had to meet and argue and decide. Delaware passed the Constitution of the United States in December 1787, only, 3 months after the Constitution was proposed. But it took 32 months for Rhode Island to do it. Some of the states had more than one convention. And the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers are coming out in the course of this debate. The first Federalist paper was written in, as I say, published in October 27, 1787. And the last one, I got the date here, on August 13, 1788. I told you that the target was New York. New York published, ratified the Constitution on July 28, 1788. And so the last Federalist paper came out a few days after the state of New York ratified. The state of New York was the 11th state to ratify. The 9th state was New Hampshire, and the constitutional ratification procedure prescribed in the Constitution says that when 9 states ratify, then the government can go into operation, which is an interesting problem, something that South Carolina makes a lot of in its secession message. It says, because it's possible if Rhode Island, and North Carolina was late too, had not ratified the Constitution, or the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th states had not, that the Union would have contracted. And it's also a fact that there was a lot of pressure put on New York, in particular, to ratify the Constitution because 9 states had. Now it's going to go. And so the 9 that did first put pressure on the 4 still to come. Shrewd of the authors of the Constitution to put that provision in there, and of course South Carolina thought that was unfair. Politics has its ways, doesn't it? What went on in the Federalist, when they were published in newspapers. They were later collected. There have been several editions of them. And it took years to find out who wrote which, because they all proceeded under the name Publius. All of the papers, all 3 men, wrote under the name Publius, and Publius was a Roman statesman known for his moderation and love of the people and subordination of himself to the people. And many of the anti-Federalist papers were also named for famous Romans. Cato, the enemy of Caesar, and Brutus, the enemy of Caesar. And so that carried the implication that the Federalists who were proposing this Constitution were like Caesar, and that claim was made. And Publius is making the claim that no, they're men of the people. And the terminology is interesting because the anti-Federalists were arguing for more federalism, that is to say, more power distributed to the states. And the Federalists adopted the name that they really wanted for themselves, and they ended up getting styled anti-Federalist, an important rhetorical mistake, or disadvantage, whether it was a mistake or not. And so what that means is, in this massive argument, the Federalists were clever. And I invite you to read them. You may make the judgment that I make about them, and that is that many of the anti-Federalist papers are tremendous things. But the Federalist is more tremendous still. You'll watch for this as you hear the lectures and read the Federalist Papers for yourself, which I very much hope you'll do. Everyone, every American citizen, in my opinion, should read them and know what's in them. And it's a delight to do that. You'll find the language is a little old, but it's like my experience when I first read James Fenimore Cooper. I thought it was terribly convoluted for the first 20 or so pages. And then somehow it took off like a rocket ship. It actually was coincident in The Last of the Mohicans with the troop leaving the fort, if you've read the book, to be attacked by a bunch of Indians. And somehow, when they first walked out the fort, somehow the cadence hit me. And I read those things with great pleasure. Now that I mention them, I may reread them. So it's worth saying, and so there was this intense debate to invent a constitution. We're 11 years after the Declaration of Independence and 4 years after the Treaty of Paris that brought the war to an end. And there's this intense debate, and the thing passed. What made it needful for it to pass? There must have been something that gave it energy. And the best source I know for that is an essay written by James Madison in April of 1787 called Vices of the Political System of the United States. And that's in our Constitution Reader. I encourage you to read it. He makes a bunch of complaints. And these complaints, by the way, every one that I'm going to name is also accepted by the anti-Federalist. They all agree that we have to have a stronger common government for the whole nation. They just think this one is too strong. And that's another important rhetorical point in the debate, because if you're admitting that change has got to happen, and you just don't like this one, that's a weaker position than if you say what we got now is really great. Why would we undo this? And Madison's complaints are that, first of all, that the Articles of Confederation were passed by a legislature. And so that means they can't really be a check on the legislature that passed it. It's like the British Constitution. The British Constitution is really made up of a bunch of big acts of the British Parliament at key moments in British history. And the doctrine over there is they can pass any law they want to, as long as the people will elect them to do it. Whereas the doctrine in this country now, and Madison very much wanted, and Hamilton and all of them, wanted this advantage. They wanted there to be one law that the people had passed. And then directly, and it's the only law the American people have ever passed, as a matter of fact. And then the people who hold and exercise the power of government could not overcome that, because they're only representatives of the people who'd passed this big law, the Constitution, directly. And that would be a check on government, and Madison complains that the Articles don't have that. And then there was money embarrassments that were huge, because the states, delegates from the states who passed in the Continental Congress, who passed the Articles of Confederation, all agreed for their states that we're going to supply these monies to the federal government. And sometimes the Congress, under the Articles, would refuse to supply the money, refuse to pass the law to requisition the money from the states. And often, even when they did that, the states wouldn't pay it. And states were ignoring treaties that the national government made with foreign powers, and they were going and making their own treaties. And they were trying to regulate each other's trade. And they were debasing their currencies, which means just print up a whole bunch of money. And that's really good for people who owe money to people in the short term, because you borrow money at one value and you pay it back at a lesser value. It's very bad in the short term for creditors. The founders believed, and I believe, that it's very bad overall. And that's because these debtors who might get relief right now, they may need to borrow money again in the future. And nobody will loan it to them or accept it at exorbitant rates. And so it makes a mess in the economy, and that was common. Madison talks about insurrection. It's a man named Daniel Shays, and he led a rebellion in Massachusetts. It went on for some months. And one of the things that they would do is, on dates when mortgages were due or mortgages were to be foreclosed either, they would take a bunch of armed people into a town and they would seize the bank and forbid there to be this collection or this foreclosure. And so if you'd lent money out to somebody, you don't have your money, you got their promise to pay you back, and if they don't pay you back, then you're broke and you can't lend any money to anybody else. And of course the people, as I say, in the short term who'd borrowed the money were sometimes happy with that and often numbered in the crowd who did this. And the states were not able to cope with this. And it was embarrassing. You know, we went and we fought these British, and they were the greatest military power on earth. They'd just beaten France in a big war, and Spain. And so now we've had all this high-sounding talk about people governing themselves, and the king had replied, and his minister had replied consistently, well, that ain't going to work. People can't govern themselves. They've got to have some powerful people to govern them, some well-born people, some aristocrats. And now look at you. You guys are running a zoo over there. It's ridiculous. And, you know, the British had a fort, one over by Detroit, not far from where I am right now. They had occupation forces on American soil. We couldn't do anything about it. We were a laughingstock. And so people were embarrassed by that because they had joined together to win this great war, and now it looked ridiculous. And that's what led to this great debate and the writing of the and it's the reason the Constitution passed, in my opinion. They could see that this thing doesn't work. And this new thing, there's a bunch of arguments for them. And back in those days, people paid attention to arguments. I think they're beginning to pay a lot of attention to arguments today. You who are watching this course are doing that. So the Federalists, you know, they would print them in newspapers, and they would paste the newspaper up in the window of the newspaper office, and somebody with a big voice would stand out front and read it out loud until there'd be crowds gathered to hear the Federalist Papers. And then the anti-Federalist papers were going around too, And so there were big arguments going on everywhere. And when you read this, the Federalist Papers, you will see that the arguments are pretty good. I mean, I've already said they're among the best. You might think that they're different in kind from the arguments we hear today. And if you think that, and I mean, the arguments are different arguments, and they're different in quality. That's my opinion. It's really remarkable. Because think how odd it is that somebody could write a series of 85 political tracts over 8 months. Busy people who are also, by the way, serving in their state ratifying conventions. Trying to win an election. And we could read those today, and serious people could say that they're among the best things ever written. Because they are. What an achievement. Like the Constitution itself. And they have an authority about the Constitution that cannot be ignored. I'm going to read you 2 passages from the Federalist that are a sample and also among my favorites. No, they are my favorites. There's a third one I was going to read, but it's not quite my favorite. My favorite of the Federalist authors is Madison. For some reason I take to him. I don't claim that he's better than Hamilton. I think probably he's not. I just like him better. And these 2 passages have something to do with that fact. In the 49th Federalist, Madison is writing about the separation of powers. He often does that. And why you have to have these checks and balances, why the Senate is important. And he says that in the Constitution, you do have these 2 bodies in the legislature, a bicameral legislature, and you have separation of powers between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And then he says, and you got the states. He's made all those arguments. And he says that's not enough, he says, because you actually have to give them, each of the bodies, the means and the interest to defend itself against the others, or else the legislature will take over the executive. They thought was a big problem. And I think today we may have the opposite problem, because the executive, which is not really run by the president, all of it, is a huge thing today, and it may take over the legislature. It sort of has in some ways. But in any case, Madison is afraid that that's what will be the course of things. And one of the ways that you'll stop that is you'll give them the power to defend themselves. For example, Congress has the power of the budget over the executive branch, and Congress has the power of advise and consent about treaties, and Congress has the power to override a veto, and Congress has the power to approve appointments, nominations by the president to serve in executive offices. And then the president, on the other hand, he's got the means to defend himself. He can veto. And that gives him like 1/3 of the votes or 1/6 of the votes in the legislature. And Madison says these things are very important, fundamentally important. And he says you got to have this deliberation, and you got to reach a settled conviction before you decide something. And if you don't have that, and this is my passage that I like so much, he says, the passions, therefore, not the reason of the public, would sit in judgment. But it is the reason alone of the public that ought to control and regulate the government. The passions ought to be controlled and regulated by the government. Now, one of my favorite books is Aristotle's Ethics. And it isn't true to say that Aristotle believes that the well-ordered soul simply has the reason in charge of the passions. What he really says is, if the reason has charge of the passions become trained. And then when they are trained, then every good choice is an interplay of thinking and desiring, and the whole soul comes together to produce it. But it starts with not letting your passion run away with itself. And Madison is proposing that solution to the body politic. The country is to be like a well-ordered soul. The second one is from the 51st Federalist, near to it, and it's about the same general theme. He's talking now about how these branches get some of the power of the other branch to defend themselves. He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. Isn't that a great thing? Lincoln repeated that phrase. The interest of the man must be connected to the duty of the place. In other words, you put somebody and you give them a power, and you need to find a way to make it in their interest to use that power well, or else they might be naughty, as people in politics and outside politics are sometimes naughty. It may be, Madison continues, a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. So it's, kind of bad that we need things like that. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be needed. If angels were to govern men, neither internal or external controls on the government would be necessary. That's the order of nature. That's what human equality means, by the way. It doesn't mean we're all the same. We're not all the same. We're all different. Everybody's different. Except in the respect that makes us human. And you can always tell the difference between the similarity among humans if you compare them. In my family, we have dogs, and they're my favorites. We have cats, too, but I don't pay attention to them. And the dogs are dogs, right? In my house, it's better to be a dog. But they're dogs. There are things they can't do. My wife and children and I, we can do those things. That makes us human. And we love each other, and my wife is near to a divine being. I guess you'd have to admit that even she was not quite an angel. This is what the Federalist Papers is about. It describes the greatest government to protect the nature and rights of man that has ever been erected. And it is the best single source about that government.